Okay, I'm ready to get started. Again, welcome everyone to EBMUD's Water Wednesday, the value of water. We are ready to get started and we will turn it over to our General Manager, Clifford Chan.
Thank you, Mona. Welcome everyone. As Mona mentioned, I'm Clifford Chan. I'm the General Manager for EBMUD. I'm really excited tonight to have this all-star panel with me today to talk about the value of water. Joining me are David Sedlak, Laurel Firestone, and Sophia Skoda. David is a Plato Malazimov Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Berkeley, where he is a director of the Berkeley Water Center. He's also the author of the 2014 book, Water 4.0, The Past, Present, and Future of Water, a future of the world's most vital resource. The forthcoming book, Water for All, Global Solutions for a Changing Climate. And most importantly, he's a proud EBMUD customer. Laurel was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board in 2019 and was reappointed by Governor Newsom in 2023. Prior to joining the board, Laurel co-founded and co-directed the Community Water Center, a statewide nonprofit environmental justice organization based in California's Central Valley and Central Coast. Her career is focused on ensuring all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water and building increased diversity, equity, and inclusivity into water decision-making. Finally, Sophia is the Director of Finance for EBMUD. She and her team are responsible for the district's general fund and pension investments, in addition to EBMUD's rates and charges, risk management, purchasing, accounting, budget, and audit functions. She formerly served as the manager of EBMUD's Resource Recovery Waste to Energy program. Under her leadership, EBMUD became the first wastewater plant in North America to become a net seller of green energy to the grid. Welcome, David, Laurel, and Sophia. So I just wanted to start, I was talking to some of my friends last week, telling them that I was going to moderate this panel on the value of water. And their reaction was something I didn't actually expect. It was, well, that's obvious. We all need water to survive. But the reality is when we talk about the value of water, it's more than just the life it sustains. Water has other societal values. It has environmental values. It has economic values. And certainly in some cultures, water also has a spiritual value. So our goal tonight is to explore the different viewpoints on the value of water. This is a complicated topic, and I hope those listening tonight will just leave curious and wanting to learn more. For those in the audience, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to work it into our conversation tonight. So I want to start with David. In your book, Water 4.0, you discuss the history of urban water systems, how they came to be, and what's next for water systems. How has the development of water systems over time changed the value of water to communities?
Well, first, Clifford, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be on this all-star panel and looking forward to the discussion. I'm also happy that you asked me to go first because it gives me the chance to use the most obvious quote that could be used tonight. And that's been attributed to Benjamin Franklin. When the well's dry, we know the worth of water. So in my experience, it's really during periods of crisis that we start to understand the value of water. And between those crises, we tend to forget the value. And just thinking about like our local situation, for example, we all expect water to come out of the tap when we turn it on. And yet in the 1920s, before the McCullamy aqueduct was built, there were serious concerns that the East Bay would run out of water or that people would have to buy water from trucks. And that's a large hassle. We also all expect that when we take that water out of the tap and drink it, it's not going to make us sick. And yet in the 1880s through 1900 or so, water was one of the leading causes of death in the United States because people caught typhoid fever and a variety of other diseases from untreated tap water. And so when we figured out how to treat water, the lifespan of Americans expanded, and we saw that it was no longer a hazard. And so we've come to just expect that in the United States, that we can drink tap water. The third thing that I think we often lose sight of is that we expect that after we use our water and we send it down the drain, it's not going to cause a problem somewhere else. And there's a myriad of problems that were caused at one time by the improper management of our sewage. But the one that's particularly relevant to us here in the East Bay is that prior to construction of the East Bay Mud Sewage Treatment Plant by the Bay Bridge, a lot of that raw sewage from the East Bay used to spill out into the mudflats. And it had reached a point where in the 1930s, when people would get on the Bay Bridge, they rolled up the windows and drove as fast as they could. And there were serious concerns that Alameda Island would become uninhabitable from the stench emanating from those mudflats. And finally, I think we all expect that our water is going to taste pretty good. And we've become spoiled here in the East Bay with the quality and taste of our water. And I know when we travel, especially in the Southwest and in arid places, and the water becomes quite a bit saltier, or maybe we go to the Midwest and it has some of that algal funkiness about it. We want to come home and drink our tap water again. And so all of those things, availability, safety, environmental damage, and even aesthetics are part of the value of the water. And without them, we would be in pretty unfortunate situation. So I think it makes our lives wealthier.
Yeah, no, and you know, as you talk about the development of water systems, and certainly in the East Bay, I mean, it seems like, you know, we're very fortunate in the East Bay, and East Bay Mud takes the responsibility, and our customers have, you know, helped invest in the infrastructure so we can have reliable, high quality, and affordable water. But that's not true for every community. And I'm just wondering, Laurel, what's your thoughts on, you know, how, you know, that inequity has affected the real or perceived value of water?
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked with, well, first of all, thanks for having me here too, and excited to be on this panel. And excited that there's so much engagement from East Bay Mud customers in this topic. I know this is a great chance to talk about value of water, which, you know, for my career so far has really been with folks that have lived in daily water insecurity and fear from the water coming from their tap, and what the quality of that water is in their homes and in schools. And I think, you know, certainly those in the East Bay service area, East Bay Mud service area, and through most of California, take that for granted. But there are hundreds of communities throughout California that don't have access to safe drinking water on an ongoing basis. And that's from either groundwater contamination of wells. We're seeing a lot more wells going dry, and especially in the drought, and especially in areas where there's a lot of overdraft and overpumping going on. And then increasingly seeing a lot of inability to pay for water. And so this is something that, you know, as I saw, as I was first starting, you know, there are communities where people were told that that's just the way it is. They shouldn't expect the water to be good in their community, and that it was fine for coffee, stop complaining. And that's where a lot of the work to try to pass the Human Right to Water Act really originated, was saying, look, the value of water is something that's universal here in our state, and everyone deserves to have access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water. And I think that's what, you know, as we talk about this conversation around the value of water, to me, the water is a reflection of our values. And so as we've developed communities and community water systems, you see that. So there's particularly many of these areas that don't have safe drinking water now, were low-income communities, farm worker communities, communities of color, where those communities were purposely excluded from larger communities, or there wasn't investment in centralized water infrastructure and access to sanitation, like you were talking about, David. And so those inequalities and really racist decision makings and policies led to the inequities that we see today, and then continue. So I think as we talk more about how we value water and what's next, really the work that we do and the way that we experience water is a reflection of our values. And I think as we develop our policies, really putting that front and center around equity, access, having a thriving community and environment are all things that need to be drivers of the water decision making that we're doing.
I don't know, Sophia or David, you want to kind of also talk about that in terms of the inequities and what can be done about that from your perspective? And is it these type of crises, David, that maybe you were talking about that kind of pushes the industry in a certain direction?
Well, one thing that I would just add to what Laurel said is, we find ourselves, for example, at East Bay Mud here, and so happy to be here. Thank you, Clifford, for inviting me to be our staff person that gets to participate. And what we see here is that we've got 25% of families in our service area where the household is making more than $200,000 a year. And we have 25% of our service area where the families are making less than $50,000 a year. So that's a challenging kind of place to be. How do we make the investments that we have to make to be able to continue to supply high quality water reliably in a sustainable manner that is, respectful of our environment and, honoring kind of our role as a steward of, in our case, the McCalmy River. And how do we do that in a way that, keeps rates as low as reasonably possible, right? And so that's a place that we find ourselves, as a team, struggling with. And we do have, thankfully, a customer assistance program. It's one of the oldest in the state of California, perhaps the oldest. It's been ongoing for more than 35 years, and it does offer a discount of up to 50% on our water bill for a certain amount of water per the number of people in the household. But that's not something that every water agency offers in California, or that they can offer currently. And so, yeah, these are challenges that we face, and that others in our state and in our nation face too.
Well, this is also an issue that wasn't obvious to me when I first started to learn about how water utilities raise revenues, that in California, there have been some legal decisions that have made it that the obvious thing that you would do is if you had a large community with lots of very prosperous people, you'd try to share the burden for providing water services more equitably by charging more money for people who are wealthier. And a variety of legal decisions has made that challenging for utilities. And I think you guys have done a really good job at trying to navigate that within the constraints of the law. But I think there's this larger question of how we pay for water infrastructure. Most of what we do to keep the water flowing, either building infrastructure or maintaining it, comes from consumer bills. And when we build the infrastructure in the first place, quite often it's subsidized in some way. There's either a bond initiative that passes or a federal law that subsidizes these things. And then you get into the day-to-day operations, the maintenance and the replacement of this stuff. And you can't raise enough money with the amount that your customers are able to pay. And you can't do the obvious thing of asking more money from wealthy people. And people don't view a water utility like a charity. So it's not like they donate money. And so you're stuck. And I think that Sophia, I think that's one of your challenges. So I'm kind of curious, looking forward, do you see a way of breaking free of that cycle of things getting built with bonds and subsidies, and then forced to maintain them with consumer bills that can't necessarily be raised as much as you might want them to keep them going?
Yeah, well, first of all, David, thank you for bringing up the issue of subsidy, because it is a really important one. We're celebrating our 100-year anniversary coming up here shortly, 2023. And in kind of doing research around our centennial, one of the things that we found, something that I didn't know, despite the fact that I've been here for 17 years, is that when our water utility started, there was an assessment on property tax bills. And that assessment was to the tune of 50 cents for every $100 of assessed valuation. Now, interestingly, we actually still receive a little bit of AV, funds, property tax funds, about 1.4 cents for every $100 of AV. So that's a dramatically different picture, as you can imagine, for us. And so again, this subsidy that you're talking about, and on the wastewater side, you have the Clean Water Act in the 70s that really built a lot of the wastewater treatment plants in the Bay Area and across the nation. These are things that folks aren't considering. And when we kind of look at our national economy, I mean, the reality is that blue collar wages, didn't keep up with inflation for a very, very long time. And I think that kind of pushed and put pressure on cities and on utilities to keep their rates low. And so we didn't make the investments that we really needed to be making for decades in some cases. And so this is where we ended up with the Jacksons of this world, and exactly the situation that you're talking about, where this infrastructure was built and then it just wasn't maintained. So as we kind of look into the future, we continue to use bond funding as you talked about. It does help us kind of create a little bit of intergenerational equity. When we look at pipes that we're replacing, I had an opportunity to be out with some of our crews some time ago, and they were replacing a line in West Oakland, and the line had in our kind of internal maps, CI 93. And I said, oh, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, it's cast iron, and that's not 1993. It was an 1893 pipe that we're still using today. And so, when we look at that, when we do use bond funds, we're basically saying the person that lives in this house isn't the only person that has to pay for the replacement of that pipe. All of the families that live in this house over the next 30 years will be contributing to that. So that's one of the ways that we continue to make those investments in infrastructure. But yes, operations, I mean, that has to be an ongoing expense, and it has to be covered, in the bill. And how do we continue to do that? I mean, I think we do need to be creative around what we can do inside of the law in California. But as you said, it's becoming more challenging, and there certainly continue to be kind of folks that put initiatives on the voters ballots and at other levels of our state sort of voting either by the public or through our legislators. And those are things that we have to really kind of fight for. And so we do have, and this is covered in the bills that are paid by our ratepayers today, we have active lobbyists in Sacramento, for example, and that lobby at the federal level as well to say, hey, look, we need to consider these things. Our public needs this water. We need to keep it affordable, and let's be really thoughtful around how we can do that.
Yeah. And maybe I'm going to jump in and ask Laurel one more question about this one, and then we have a few good questions from the audience I want to throw out as well. But looking at this, Laurel, for East Bay Mud, the cost of water is about a penny a gallon. And when you compare that to bottled water, I mean, we're talking, people are paying orders of magnitude more for bottled water than the water that they get from the tap. But at a penny a gallon, I mean, do you think our customers understand the cost of water that they're getting at home? And are we as an industry undervaluing water?
Well, yeah, I don't think we have any idea what goes into bringing safe water into your home, into the tap. I think there's an idea that if you go into the store and pay a lot of money for bottled water, that you're going to get something better. But there's, our job at the state is to regulate really to incredibly high standards, the testing and requirements around the quality of water that are even higher than what is set for bottled water. So, I think there's certainly not a lot of understanding of everything that it takes to go into serving water, whether it's protecting the source water and all of the work to, we're responsible for regulating, but also folks are really stewards of the watersheds that are supplying the sources of drinking water, of all of the infrastructure that brings that throughout the state and then into people's homes, all the maintenance that goes into that, and the treatment. So I think that's something that certainly as an industry and a state, being able to understand what goes into something helps you value it. I also will say there's a real obvious tension between all of the investments that we're going to need to do because of this changing climate, because of this now whiplash between extreme dries, extreme wets, and shifting the infrastructure that we need to be able to take advantage of that. And also just to diversify our water sources and utilize more local sources. All of this takes a huge amount of investment, and that's on top of, you know, just the maintenance of all the investments and infrastructure that have already been made, and the increasing level of treatment that we're starting to do as we, you know, learn about different new contaminants. And so as we look at what our role is at the state, we think about both how can we subsidize the cost of water in terms of, you know, public, we talked about bonds, and really it's at the end of the day, it's taxpayer dollars going in to support water infrastructure. But we have a lot fewer opportunities and tools, and really haven't done much in the past until recently around subsidizing customer ability to pay. And there is a limit to that. And as you talked about, there's, you know, there's extreme disparities, as you said, Sophia, within this service area, but all over the state. And we do have constitutional limits on direct subsidies between customers. And water and wastewater are really the only two utilities where we don't have a statewide low-income ratepayer assistance program. And so this is something I think as we see these really increasing cost pressures of investments that are needed, and continuing to see the increased disparities in terms of wealth and income, it's really coming to a head, and will only continue to do so to figure out how we can, you know, more systems can do what East Bay MUD's doing in terms of offering these subsidy programs. It's really unique here. There's very few that have anything like that. And we did just in COVID have arrearages debt forgiveness funding that we could do, which was one of the first times we've really seen the ability to subsidize consumer, you know, consumer ability to pay in terms of debt forgiveness. But that's, you know, I think a bellwether of things that we're going to have to be working on in the years to come.
Yeah, and you know, I'm going to just jump around a little bit just to get one question from the audience. Maybe David, you can start, and Laurel and Sophia, you can chime in as well. But you know, one of the questions is, you know, it's about water availability and the inequities in water availability. You know, is that based on, you know, what they're calling antiquated, riparian, and appropriative rights, water rights? You know, we at East Bay MUD, you know, we got our water rights on McCulmy in 1923, 1924 is when we got those water rights. You know, are there movements, you know, at the state level or ideas on how maybe updating the water rights might help address the water availability issue? I don't know if David, you want to start, Laurel and Sophia?
Well, I can, and I think that this has always been a little bit of a political third rail in California, and in some ways it's a really hard thing to unwind, because when we look at the disparities among water rights between different users, we first have to acknowledge that the majority of the water that's appropriated from the environment is going to agriculture, and not all of that agriculture is all high value crops. Some of it is forage to run dairy. Some of it is to grow things like alfalfa and cotton and things that maybe we might not choose to grow if we were starting over. But because someone has those historic senior water rights, that's the value of their land and their property and their whole enterprise tied up there, and the state has a hard time justifying coming in and taking it. So we could talk about like the Colorado River and down south, and the way the Imperial Valley irrigation districts have this incredible amount of water, and they're not always growing the highest value crops with it. I think in order to take those rights away from someone, it's a big political fight, because that's what makes the land valuable down there. And so I see, in a time of a changing climate where that surface water is less reliable. I see from 4 decades of political fighting over these things and not a lot of progress being made. Perhaps a better way is to start thinking about breaking our reliance on these imported water sources, at least for our cities. And I think we're seeing that in Southern California now, as the mayor of Los Angeles and more recently San Diego, and maybe before all of those, Orange County, tried to come up with ways of creating a local water supply so they wouldn't be stuck in this constant political fighting about appropriated water rights and senior water rights. So you see the mayor of Los Angeles, well, when Garcetti was there, he talked about Los Angeles becoming independent of sources like the Colorado River and the Eastern Sierras through water recycling, through conservation, through stormwater capture and use, and even through seawater desalination. I think these kinds of things change the political dynamic and mean that maybe we don't have to have that battle, which I'm just not sure it can be resolved over the time frame that we'd like it to be resolved, unless something drastic happens, because many of those water rights have lots and lots of lawyers to help them out to retain those. But maybe someone has a different view and is more optimistic about those things changing.
Laurel, Sophia?
I mean, I think this is certainly a hot topic right now, especially, as we have seen in the drought, just when there isn't enough water to go around to, and people are having to be curtailed, and the order of who gets curtailed first is really fundamentally inequitable, right? It's just based on who is there first. And that doesn't count Native Americans and tribal communities in many cases that were were excluded from treaties and different water rights systems, appropriational systems originally. So there's also a ton of challenges around just having the tools to administer the water rights system and knowing who's using what and that's one of the things we're charged with, is administering the water rights system. But we don't have the power and data to do that effectively right now, outside of the kinds of emergency actions that happened this past year. So there's a lot of discussions in the legislature right now on how to modernize our water rights system, and it is really hard. It's, I think, going to be interesting how that is navigated in the state.
Yeah, that is going to be a big challenge, and maybe just kind of.
I just want to jump in and say one last thing on that. A couple of years ago, I was this was under Governor Schwarzenegger. I was at a forum that East Bay MUD kind of holds that's supposed to just kind of be a bit of a thinking sort of opportunity for the industry. And I remember it specifically because there was a woman that stood up at the back with her baby, which in wastewater, people don't show up with their babies, and she questioned the then kind of czar of DWR at the time and said, when are we going to reform our water rights? And there was kind of silence from the panel that was up there. And then somebody said, well, because she said Spain's reformed their water rights. Like, some of our water rights go back to the time when we were part of Spain. Australia's reformed their water rights. Like, we have a lot of kind of similarities, with Australia, both kind of weather-wise and kind of, our age and sort of, our history. And when are we going to reform our water rights? And then there was silence. And then somebody said, well, they didn't really reform water rights in Australia until farmers started committing mass suicide. And I thought, is that what we're waiting for?
Yeah, no, I do want to kind of jump back to something David talked about, what's happening in Los Angeles. As we look at this more resilient water supply and look at maybe more recycled water or desalination, or maybe even going to groundwater, we've had the issue because for better or worse, we've been talking about our pristine snowmelt for the last century. And different communities have different perceptions of recycled water or groundwater, and they feel like they're getting something lesser. And just from your perspective, maybe I'll start with Laurel and David and maybe Sophia, is like, how do we move the needle, to be able to be more climate resilient, while people feel like they're still getting the same quality. That value that they perceive for the last century has changed. David, Laurel, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think there's especially in the drought, there's no question that we're just starting to see every drop as an important resource rather than a waste. And this huge push towards, as David said, trying to, especially in cities, move away from imported water where we're transporting, snow, especially snow melt across the state or multiple states, to cities where instead we can recycle the wastewater that we have that can provide not just water supply benefits, but water quality benefits, because we're not having to discharge the same, improving water quality in our rivers and bays and oceans, and the impact that also has on the environment. Looking at conserving and just what that means as we've been in this emergency conservation, being able to shift to having long-term efficiency standards, so that conservation is a way of life and we're not having to say import as much or use as much water, and therefore import as much. And there is a very real and I think appropriate concern that folks have of, this idea of, are we using, I would much rather get pristine snow melt from the mountains and springs of the Sierras than thinking about treating wastewater. But at the end of the day, actually, it comes down to the processes that go into testing and treating that water that then is delivered to customers. And so, we have a very robust process that we take seriously to establish regulatory requirements for all sources of water that are put into the drinking water system. And that's those regulations are not just sort of a bureaucratic hurdle, they're really important protections that are in place. And that, I think, to the point of folks not knowing what goes into the water that they get, seeing the level of treatment, like extremely advanced treatment that goes on for a lot of these, for advanced treatment recycling plants, for example, is far greater than anything that you're seeing from other sources of water. And just because, unfortunately, just because things are coming from the Sierras doesn't mean it's not exposed to contaminants in our environment as well. So rather than thinking of one source as better than the other, I think what the important thing is looking at what's delivered into the system and is that meeting those quality standards. And that's something that I know EBMUD, but really, the state takes seriously as a responsibility. But it is just a cultural shift. It's about developing trust with customers and being able to help folks understand what goes into delivering the water that they're drinking. There's a lot of education I've seen happen around and been able to participate in around getting folks to see the treatment plants that are being created, and also understanding how shifting to local supplies is also valuing the water that's needed for natural systems, and rather than tapping rivers for just urban needs, that there's a value in supporting the fish and ecosystems and cultures that rely on those and communities that rely on those, which is another, I think, thing that is important to consumers, but is harder to make the connection with when they're learning about these sorts of decisions of where you're getting your water source and what the implications are of that.
Yeah, I just really briefly will add that I remember some years ago when we had a drought, we were bringing in alternative supplies, and one of the, I think, exciting things that we had done at that time was we were bringing in water from farmers and had created kind of an agreement where we had asked some folks that were farming things like cotton, alfalfa, that are not like an almond tree that has to be watered every year, so crops that can fallow, to say, hey, listen, can we buy your water and use it for our urban drinking supplies, and you fallow your crops, and we'll pay you for all the costs that you incur to exercise your machines, your profit that you would have made, all of that. And I remember I was shopping in Walnut Creek at the time one day, and I had a coffee at the Pete's Coffee that is on Locust. I think we've torn up the street right now to replace some pipes, but anyways, and I had a little glass of water after I had my coffee, and I thought, oh gosh, like maybe the freezer that they were keeping the ice, like had something funky in it. It didn't taste so good, and went about my day. Was meeting someone for an early dinner at a sushi restaurant. Had a glass of water and thought, oh, it wasn't the ice. That's our water. That's our East Bay Mud water. And so, yeah, bringing in different supplies, with the changes that drought is going to bring, with it is hard for our customers to, we're used to this absolutely gorgeous water that we get to drink all the time. And so that's challenging. We are trying to address some of that over the next 5 years. We're going to be spending $500 million on 2 of our major treatment plants, Upper San Leandro and Orinda, to try to kind of deal with the larger variation that we're going to see in water quality, because we can't, ensure that we're going to have, pristine snow melt. But we'll be okay this next year.
I want to go back to what Clifford's original question was, and also amplify some of the things Laurel mentioned. So about 15 years ago, I got invited to a meeting that was organized in Southern California about recycled water. And the organizers were the non-governmental organization Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I was a little bit surprised that they took an interest in recycled water, and I wasn't sure if their angle was they were suspicious of it or they thought it would be dangerous to health. And so when I got there, I asked the organizer why this was an area of interest to them, and they said they saw the future of water supply in Southern California possibly being seawater desalination, and they were concerned about the greenhouse gas emissions, and they thought that recycled water would be lower greenhouse gas emissions. And that turned on a light for me that relates back to this idea of the value of water. And so when the discussion about where the water comes from also includes the environmental impacts and includes the stewardship of watersheds, then it changes the discussion. And so I think what Laurel said is very right, that when people start thinking that if we're better at stewarding our water in cities, we can leave more in the environment and produce less pollution. But I also think that this question of whether the public has suspicions about water that used to be sewage and becoming drinking water, it's a lot more than just an education program. I think there are 2 prongs to it. In our research, we've studied a phenomenon that social scientists refer to as technology legitimization. And to summarize, what we learned is that the public has less problem drinking recycled water if they have trust in the organizations that produce it and regulate it, if they encounter it in their day-to-day lives, and they see it as a possible benefit to them. And so I think it's very important for us to encourage a culture of transparency and technical competence when we take on these new types of water supply projects, so there isn't a mistake or some kind of PFAS that people discover later was in the water because the regulators and the engineers didn't do their jobs properly. It's also important for the public to realize that these less drought vulnerable sources of water are better for our communities, and in the long term will have economic benefits. But finally, I think there is an issue of aesthetics and taste, and I think we're probably not doing enough to assure that the water we deliver tastes good. So even though less than 2% of the water coming through the pipes ever gets consumed by people. Most of it goes on the lawn or is used in showers and washing machines and toilets. It's important to public perception that the water not have those off tastes. And there are things that we can do with recycled water in the way that we remineralize it. Most people don't realize that when you drink Dasani water or one of those waters from a big beverage company, they do reverse osmosis on the water, the same thing that those advanced water recycling facilities do. But after reverse osmosis, they add in the mixture of salts that gives that water its characteristic, more pleasant taste. And so I think we should be thinking about more than just meeting the minimum standards. We should be paying more attention to treating water and preparing water so that it's aesthetically pleasant, not necessarily for the health benefits, even though there are some, but to let consumers know that we want a product that they're happy to have and not something that seems like it's second best.
Yeah, and I do want to jump in on the PFAS, but I just saw another question come up, and I thought I maybe just might tell a story about this one. So somebody was asking, there's a lot of resentment of East Bay mud from farmers in the Central Valley who say that East Bay mud stole their McCollum water. And I remember when I started East Bay mud 26 years ago, and I had to work up in the Sierras, and they told me, oh, it's better if you don't drive in an East Bay mud car up there. I didn't understand what they meant. Of like, why should I be driving with a big East Bay mud logo next to me up in the foothills, until I understood this resentment. And so the question is there a way that we can that resentment will ever go away? And looking at conjunctive use, and the answer is yes. We are looking at conjunctive use in the eastern San Joaquin County, and yes, I do think we can build trust, because I believe there's a common problem now that we all have to work together to address. And I think that trust will get built over time. And this conjunctive use project that we call the DREAM project will go a long way to address that issue. But jumping back to you mentioned PFAS, and this is a question for all of you. We are hearing about PFAS now. We don't generate the PFAS as a water utility, but it's coming into our systems, both on the water side and the wastewater side. The question is, who should pay for that? Who should pay for that cleanup of these emerging contaminants?
Well, I would say I think there is a responsibility on behalf of government. The federal government. I mean, I grew up, in countries overseas where there were, hundreds of thousands and millions of people that didn't have access to clean water and sanitation. And, there was kind of a real the value of water, I think took on a very different sort of meaning. Shortages during the day, potentially not available many days, and you'd fill up, tanks to kind of use subsequently, quality variable, all of that. And, I just think that with all of those kinds of things, there is a responsibility on behalf of the central government, as there was in many of these countries, and who were struggling to meet it, to say, we need to be able to have water that's safe for our populations to be able to be healthy and to thrive. And so I think that's an issue that, we're starting to see some more federal interest again in water. And I think we need to keep our voices, as part of the mix to advocate, on behalf of that. But ultimately, even with a subsidy, I think we will be paying more as ratepayers in our bill for, treating PFAS and other contaminants out of our water.
I think though, Sophia, that we are that government in a way, and I kind of see the PFAS question as one of like two distinct flavors. There will be places where there's a clear source of the PFAS, whether it's a manufacturing facility or an airport that used firefighting foams. And in some ways that there's some responsibility historically when you can find the point source of pollutants, and maybe they need to go back to the manufacturers of those chemicals and fight with them about whether they're a defective product and they knew something, and that takes years and years. But there's this other form of PFAS which is ubiquitous. It comes from the textiles we choose to wear, It comes from the materials we put in our carpetings and on our couches and in our homes. And we wanted those things and we benefited from them. And then we learned that they had these toxic chemicals in them. And I think looking back in history and how these things have worked out in the past is that eventually everyone in the United States contributes to solving the problem. And I think that the question for us is, if it comes down to spending many millions of dollars at just about every city in America to take PFAS out of the water supply, how does that compare to other ways we might spend money? And I think we don't know the answer to that question yet, but I predict that over the next year or two, as we go from having scores of cities that are grappling with PFAS contamination and consumers that are aware of it to many hundreds, that we're going to start having discussions about whether we can actually do it. So those people who don't know, the EPA released the regulations, the maximum contaminant levels for drinking water this week, and they're very stringent. And it looks like we're going to have tens or hundreds of millions of people across the country whose drinking water could be out of compliance with that new MCL. And it's a good question because the technologies for removing PFAS are still quite expensive. And so I think you're going to hear more. If you haven't heard a lot about it already, you're going to hear more about it in the next 2 to 3 years.
So maybe
David, I just wanted to say I appreciate your distinction of kind of ongoing PFAS versus kind of legacy PFAS, and that's a really good point. That I think we do need more just generally kind of green chemistry and kind of ownership on the part of corporations that are producing products that have environmental impacts that impact things like drinking water. So thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I wonder if maybe Laurel first is, these companies that have created these chemicals are and then we all have a certain responsibility for purchasing this, but these companies have in some ways externalized these costs, they've gone on to make profits, and now it is up to government or others to address this issue. What are your thoughts on that, Laurel?
Yeah, I think David's right. There's some cases where we have there's real bad actors and clear polluters. I not personally, I think of 1,2,3 trichloropropane, which we recently adopted an MCL for, where there's responsible parties. Shell and Dow are there's lawsuits that have where they are needing to take on the cost of that treatment. But we live in a country and a world where we are allowing chemicals to be used before we fully understand what the implications of those are. And it does externalize those costs when we find out later. In some ways, I feel like it's similar to to climate change and carbon emissions, and that we are paying for these, and there are folks that have that our society continues to run on a lot of fossil fuels and use a lot of things that cause carbon emissions, but it's costing us so much money to have the implications of that. And that's really just a pervasive challenge around trying to build in the real costs of the impacts downstream of, if you will, of what we're doing in our lifestyles here. One other thing I want to mention just before I forget is that I do think it's important, back to this issue of trust, and I think, David, you're right. Both Sophia, you talked about taste. And I think if people notice that suddenly their water doesn't taste as good, then they're not going to trust it. And if we want people to be able to value the water that they're paying for, that we need to make sure that it tastes and looks good. Especially as we shift to maybe these new, more localized water sources. But as long as we have hundreds of communities in California that don't have access to safe drinking water, I think folks aren't going to trust it. Because you're hearing about communities where they can't trust it because it's not safe. They shouldn't trust it, right? And even though the vast majority of Californians are being served tap water that meets all the standards, when you can drive down the road and stop in a restaurant and not have safe water from the tap, or your cousin when you go visit doesn't have safe water, then it's going to mean you don't trust your tap water either. So it just, I think, goes to this sort of full circle around what are our values, and that we're all kind of collectively need to have a commitment and a responsibility around ensuring everyone can have access to safe drinking water. Otherwise it erodes all of ours.
Yeah.
And I think that trust doesn't come back quickly once it's lost. I think that takes a generation to build back. And so it's even more important not to lose it if you have it.
Yeah, absolutely right. That trust is easy to lose, hard to gain. We have probably about 10 more minutes, 8 to 10 more minutes. And I want to try to consolidate 3 questions from the audience. I think they're really good. The first one is, we're witnessing the aridification of the West. And we're also, seeing that we have a housing crisis in California that also requires water. Is water conservation, building more reservoirs, more purple pipes, is that our solution to our water supply reliability issue?
I mean, I think, we've seen in the state how in a lot of the urban areas, how we've had really big increases in population, but big decreases in per capita and total water use, not just per capita. And so, I don't think that water demands are and reduced aridification are a reason not to aggressively address the housing crisis that we have in the state, right? We need that. That's not a reason to. I think sometimes it can be used as an excuse to not do the housing that needs to be done, but it does mean that that our strategies need to be focused on creating that efficiency in new development. And we have, I think this is where the governor has a big water supply strategy. We're looking, head on, this is the amount of water we're expecting to lose in the state due to aridification, and what are the different portfolios of strategies. And that includes things like recycled water reuse, on-site reuse, purple pipe is one example of the different strategies folks can use. But I don't think there's any question that we're going to need to continue to reduce our water use and diversify our sources and really focus in on these kind of more drought resilient, localized water sources.
David, Sophia, what do you think about more reservoirs and more purple pipe?
What do I think? Or
Go on, Sophia.
No, you go ahead, David.
I like picking up on what Laurel said. I think that there's tremendous unrealized per capita water use reductions, but it's not going to come from low flow shower heads and front loaded washing machines anymore. Some of it's going to come from smart growth, where instead of building homes in places where people are going to have lawns that consume half of their water, we're going to push for density, which also facilitates transit and low carbon lifestyles. We're also going to see like the lead that San Francisco is showing us of being able to recycle water within buildings, so it never even has to go to the treatment plant. But whether we have more reservoir, I don't see too many more reservoirs being built, and purple pipes are generally non-potable water reuse, which is really waning here in California. And so I think if we're going to build reservoirs, we're probably going to be building them to support aquatic ecosystems as much as we're going to be building them to supply cities. And so I'm not sure it's the way out for California's urban populations. I think the direction that Laurel talked about seems like a much more viable approach.
Sophia, anything?
I just wanted to say that, I often hear from people, I'm sure, all of us on this call, here, oh, well, we just need to build more storage. And, one of the things is, even the current weather patterns that we're seeing now, we don't know that these are going to persist, right? We don't know what things are going to look like. And so, rather than, I think, trying to assume that what we are experiencing, currently is going to be exactly what it's like in the future, pursuing these kind of multi-pronged, strategies where we're looking for, reuse as much as we can, looking for creative opportunities, all of those sorts of pieces, smart growth, all of that is, I think how we win. One of the things I actually we were putting together a budget book recently. We have some fun facts that we put in there, and there was one that kind of amazed me, that today East Bay Mud is recycling the equivalent of about 250,000 baths for every day. And so that means almost a bath for every single family residence in our district, which, I think is amazing. And so, I think there's more, there's different. And I think that, the amazing thing about humans is that there is this potential to be incredibly creative, and this is the time to do it.
So, we could talk about this for just countless hours, and we haven't even talked about the value of water to the environment. But, I'm looking at the questions, and I just want to give everyone an opportunity to answer this question that seems to be popping a lot in the chat, which is the human right to water. And maybe you can also talk a little bit about the environmental value of water too. But we'll just end with each of you making a comment on, what does the human right to water mean to you, and what's the future of water? And maybe we'll start with David.
Oh, gee, I was hoping you'd ask Laurel first. Well, okay. So I think I have some idea about what Laurel will say about the human right to water, so I don't want to steal her fire, but I probably agree with much of what she'll say about it. But I wanted to add like another thought to kind of a global thought that ties the human right to water and the right of the environment to water together. And that is where you started, Clifford, that sometimes there's something a little special about water, a little spiritual about water, a little bit of a reflection of our overall values and what we think of each other. So we're not talking about a human right to electricity or a human right to internet or a human right to cell phones. We're talking about a human right to water. And I think it's something that that is a little mysterious and a little personal, that really resonates with me when I think about whether every Californian deserves a certain amount of water each day, and whether the environment deserves its own right to water and the maintenance of that. And I think that it does feel like it's at a level of an intangible, in a way, of existence, that we're reflecting the value that our culture puts not only on the self and our own self-actualization and personal interests, but what we think of the people around us and the places we live. And I'll leave it at that.
Laurel, would you like to go next, Laurel?
Sure. Yeah, certainly human right to water means everyone, no matter where you live in California, should have safe and affordable drinking water that's reliably able to be accessed from your tap. And, I think is really more than anything, again, this value that we are setting forth as a state, that is around equity, that is around thinking about water as fundamental to human needs, but also to community needs. And, I've seen more and more an understanding of how important water is, not just for water and sanitation, but also for things like, do you have, is the river through your community flowing with water? Do you have access to fish that are important for your culture or for your subsistence fishing? Do you have harmful algal blooms that are that are causing fish kills or other hazards to you or your family or your pets. And so I think it captures this this value of water as fundamental and also more complex and sort of intimate than just a resource or a pipe or an engineering solution. This is really something that is fundamental to what we value as a society.
Sophia, would you like to close it out?
I'd like to close it out. Okay. I guess I just would like to say that, I grew up the daughter of a civil engineer who worked in water supply and sanitation in Asia and Africa. And, I grew up with, more photos than you can imagine of, children around hand pumps. And I believe, very deeply in the human right to water, and that everybody, I'm getting teary-eyed as I say this, and every child and every person deserves clean, reliable water. And at EBMUD, on behalf of everyone that works here, I want you to know that we're committed to that.
Thank you, Sophia. You said that very nicely. I'll pass off to Mona in a second just to make some closing remarks. But I want to thank Sophia, Laurel, and David for joining us tonight on this conversation, and everyone in the audience spending their evening with us. Mona, would you like to talk about how they can get access to this information?
Sure. I typed in the chat the email for Water Wednesday. If you have a question that you'd like answered, if you would send it to us via email, we'll get a response to you and get back to you. Also, this recording will be available probably with Rolando, but probably we'll have it up at least by Monday. And you can go to EBMUD on YouTube, go to EBMUD Water Wednesday, and you'll find the recordings there. And we'd like to invite everyone to join us next month for our annual water supply update. It should be interesting this time. So that'll be on April 26th. I want to make sure I get it right. Sorry. Yes, April 26th, after our official water supply update to our board. So please join us. We'll be here waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Laurel, again. Everyone have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.